Okay, welcome everybody to How Green Is Your Money, a joint event between Path Financial and Business Declares. We're here today to understand what we can do with our money to support efforts to tackle the climate crisis. So you're in very safe hands. Path Financial were actually the UK's first financial advisors explicitly set up to help tackle the climate emergency. And so I, for one, am very keen to learn a few things from them about today's event. In terms of what we're going to do today before 2 o'clock, we're going to hear from various different speakers from PATH. We're going to hear a little bit about how the evolution of green money. We'll be starting to think around some of the principles of how do we make your money count most effectively and still in a green and environmentally mindful way. And the thing that you're probably most all looking forward to is to understand, well, where do I start? So that's going to be the focus of today. We're going to be going up until bang on 2 o'clock in terms of the session. I'm going to take my slides down for a second so you can all see each other. Just encourage you to pop yourselves on camera if you are willing. And I am very simply going to do a quick round of intros to my colleagues at Business Declares. So I wonder, Fiona, is there a few words you'd like to say to introduce Business Declares?
Yes, thank you very much, Lucy. Welcome everyone. I'm Fiona Ellis from Business Declares, and maybe know one or two of you. It's lovely to see your faces. And so our purpose is to inspire, support and connect businesses together to accelerate urgent action on the climate and social and ecological emergency. And we've been going about 3 years since that wave of protests before the pandemic, and now have over 100 members. So we're really pleased to have Path Financial as a member. They've been a member since January this year, and because this is such an important issue, really delighted to have them providing us with their expertise for our membership and beyond, and really hope that some of you might also consider joining as well. So back to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Fiona. As I said, it is a joint event, but from today we're mainly going to be benefiting from the expertise of Path Financial. So just to get started, before I introduce David, is just to ask you just to pop in the chat box what you're hoping to get from today's event. So is there anything in particular that you are hoping to learn? So very briefly, just in the chat box, just to get an idea of why you're here today. So Michelle is noting what ethical banking options are for business particularly. Yeah, so we have a mixed crowd today. So some of you are here as micro businesses, small businesses, some medium-sized businesses. Some of you here as individual members. So Michelle's interested in the ethical banking options. I know some of the other questions we've had are around other financial services. John is asking what would be quick and easy wins to have better impact. Well, you're in the right place, because moving your money is definitely one of the most effective things that you can do. So ethical banking, another shout for ethical banking. Okay, good. Well, you're getting a good steer here then, David, of what the crowds are looking for. So without further ado, then I'm going to hand over to David, who's going to talk to you a little bit about Path Financial themselves.
Hi everybody, delighted to be with you, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules for doing something rather unusual, which is engage with a subject which most people find to be two things: one, boring, and two, complex. But I hope we'll leave the call today understanding that actually there's something of personal interest which you can take away from the call, but also something of the how important money can be in influencing outcomes for people and planet. Now, just depending on the screen view that I've got, Lucy, I'm not seeing my slide deck, so if you could bring that up. Now, I've just got a sort of 3 or 4 minute quick introduction about who we are and who we serve, but it's possibly useful to know a little bit about the evolution of Path Financial. Well, the company was set up really to answer the type of comment that Attenborough is making here. I had a personal epiphany having watched the Netflix documentary Cowspiracy about the environmental impact that, in particular, animal agriculture had. That led me to understanding about the divestment movement. This was at the time I was doing a very deep dive of my personal values, and I realized that what I was doing at the time in terms of financial planning was putting millions and millions of pounds every year into industries which were doing damaging things for people and planet. I realized that that wasn't something that I could continue with, and I also realized that there were no companies out there to serve like-minded people who actually wanted their money to behave better. Now, Rowan's going to talk more about that in a minute, and we'll talk about the practical impacts of money shortly. But our purpose basically is to empower consumers to take these abstract assets that are in black boxes called things like pensions and ISAs and all the rest of it, where we don't really understand what they're doing, and to give you as consumers a voice, I suppose, in terms of what your money's doing, the influence it's having in the world, and changing the very behavior of capitalism, ultimately. So hopefully that's a useful quick introduction. Who do we serve? Individuals and businesses, and in the case of individual business owners, your financial outcomes are almost inevitably wrapped up with your business outcomes. But fundamentally, we serve to empower consumers, give them a voice, but it just so happens that we're great financial planners, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute, which is the practical takeaways of the call. But I'd like to just hand back to Lucy to introduce Rowan to talk about impact investment.
Muted myself. Brilliant, thanks, David. And we will obviously share the links. Carla's already done it fantastically, just showing the links about Path's work, so that you can read into it in a bit more detail. So we're now going to shift over, and we're going to hear from Rowan Harding. If you give us a wave, Rowan. And Rowan is going to be talking to you about the evolution of green money. So Rowan, I'm going to hand over to you, and if you want to just let me know what you'd like to do with your slides, that'd be fab.
That would be lovely. Thank you very much, Lucy. So nice to meet everybody. And if you're happy to move on to slide 4 for me, that would be great. Hopefully everyone can see this. Wonderful. So where to start? It's a huge slide here, and really my question to everyone is, well, do you know where your pension is invested? Do you know where your stocks and shares ISA is invested? Which companies and organisations does it support? I'm sure everyone probably has an idea of the bank they're invested in, but do they have any idea of what that bank supports itself? So probably the first thing to say is then, have you looked under the bonnet to see whether or not you've got any sort of ethical screening at all with your finances? That's a really good place to start. So it's very hard to tell once you start looking under the bonnet. And so I'm inviting you to have a little look here to see whether or not you would be willing to look under the bonnet and maybe just consider how green those investments are. So imagine we have a scale here, and we've got this 50 shades of green instead of 50 shades of grey for some people who might have come across that. And we've got light green down one end, we've got dark green on the other end of that scale. There are certainly some investments that will start off on the light green part of the scale. Actually, that's in the middle on our slides here. But most investments, most traditional investments, will be starting in that red section. So The red section is very much your traditional invested in environmentally damaging mining, fossil fuels, aviation, gambling, you name it, tobacco industry, all doing a lot of harm. Now, if you move over into that lighter green part of this 50 shades of green scale here, then there might be a little bit of screening out of some negatives, not all negatives. So perhaps I'll tell you a little bit about that, because that's probably quite an important point. Even if you think you are getting something which is slightly ethical, or really ethical because it's been branded as ESG or SRI, and there's a whole load of acronyms. It might just be called responsible. You would expect that it's in line with your values, but unfortunately, I'm going to say it's probably not when you start digging down. So ESG, for example, stands for environmental, social, and governance. And actually, what you'll find is that the governance side of it works really, really well, and you'll get the inclusion of something which scores very highly on governance in a so-called ethical investment. But that could be a company like British American Tobacco, because they do score high on governance. But obviously, in terms of their environmental impact, their social impact, absolutely appalling. So I would definitely suggest looking very carefully about whether or not it's doing the right thing. If we step further down this spectrum of green here, and we get to the really deep dark green, then we're looking down the very far end of the scale at philanthropy, and we're looking at you know, gifting to charity, for example. We're not all you know, really deep pocketed, and we do also need to make sure we look after ourselves as well. So actually it is important to make sure that we have our own pensions and investments too, as well as giving to charity if we can. And if we take a slight step back in that deep dark green area, we get to what's known as positive impact investing. And that's actually far better than the light end of the spectrum. So the light end of the spectrum, as I say, is just a little bit of excluding some of the negatives. Positive impact, on the other hand, though, we're really focusing on getting this right in terms of excluding all of the negatives, but actively seeking companies and organizations that are doing good for people and planet. And it is possible, absolutely possible. So I suppose probably the next thing to say is how does that happen? Because it is complicated. You have to have very strict selection criteria. It requires time, expertise, and a lot of data. So it does require specialist help. The taxonomy of ethical investing is really starting to take shape, certainly in more recent years. There's more legislation coming into place in many more countries and jurisdictions around the world. And these regulations are going to play a really important part, particularly with greenwashing, as I talked about with that light green side of it. So if I just ask Lucy to jump onto the next slide for me, I will hopefully explain a little bit about what we do. In terms of positive impact investing, we want to do as much as we possibly can to have a positive impact in all sorts of different areas. So the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and you'll see there's an acronym on here, the UN SDGs, as they're known on this slide. Very colourful. There's 17 of these covering all sorts of things: climate change, clean water, helping alleviate poverty, renewable energy. There's absolutely loads. So how can you make sure that you are doing something positive? Well, we want to contribute towards solutions. So we aim to align ourselves as far as possible with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Quite a shock to know that pretty much most investments are not considering this at all. So there are huge opportunities in this space now than say 20 years ago, 10 years ago. But imagine all of the world's pension funds, 50 trillion globally, all doing harm. And you can see the little chart on the side there, the World Equity Index, and even the UK Equity Index. There's quite a lot of red on that. If we could change that and have a difference, have a positive difference, and move that over into positive impact, look at the green side of it, 50 trillion. That is a huge amount that could have such a positive difference. I'm going to ask Lucy to jump onto the next slide for me, so I can just very quickly show you real life impact here. I think this is a great infographic because it is quite shocking to realise what a difference your finances can have. So in terms of where they might be at the moment and having a negative impact, and where they could be if they are having a positive impact. So in terms of the average UK pension, we've put a statistic on here, and this is an average, 23 tons of CO2 emissions each year. So that could, you know, if you have a business with 10 employees, equate to 230 tons of CO2 a year. And that is every single year. That is the equivalent to, and I like the eating 58,000 cheeseburgers, not that I would eat a cheeseburger, but that's quite a shocking statistic when you look at it. Anyone who's sat down and joined us today and they've got their cup of tea in hand, I'm sure you probably boiled the kettle to get that. That is equivalent to 3 million times in 1 year for 10 employees boiling that kettle. I mean, that's quite immense. So this, I think, gives you a bit of a picture in terms of how much that impact is. Anyone been on holiday recently over the summer months? The infographic says it there. You've got flying from London to New York 390 times in 1 year. I mean, you know, there's not even enough days for that, is there? So one thing to say is that when polled, employees really are concerned about climate change. I know I am. It's incredibly important. It's 84% of employees, 87% of employees actually want their companies, those decision makers, to take action on climate destroying pensions. And you know, you can see why, even if you don't know these infographics, these particular statistics, you would still want to. I hope that has shocked everyone a little bit. That's probably the best way to put it. So there is one more slide, and then I'm going to hand back to Lucy if there's time. Here we go. This very quick snapshot just to share with everyone, to say, actually, look at these two benchmarks. You've got in green positive impact investments over a time period here from 2017 to earlier this year, compared with traditional investing in the red. And you can see a difference, and they're really starting to separate now. Imagine what could happen over the future, the trajectory, with everyone pushing in the right direction to divest from the negative, reinvest into the positive. And I'm going to hand back to Lucy. Hopefully food for thought, that one.
Thanks very much, Rowan. That is fascinating. And actually, that graph you just showed speaks directly to a comment that John just put in the chat box. So John mentioned a few people have suggested that a good investment fund is more likely to be resilient over time, as it's less likely to receive a public backlash. So that's fascinating to see, you know, in hard data, the potential financial benefits of green investing. We asked you a couple of questions before you joined the session today, and one of the things that many of you asked was actually ultimately how do green investments compare to what is perceived to be more traditional investments. So hopefully, Rowan, you've very conclusively answered the question there. So I just want to pause at this point and just check if anybody's got any questions or comments from what they've heard from David's brief introduction to Path, but also what Rowan has just been talking about in terms of the evolution of green money. So does anybody have any questions that they just want to pop in the chat? We're not going to take questions too much now, but we just want to hold them so that we can make sure that our speakers can address that. Fiona asked a key question in terms of how do we find out what our banks actually support in terms of negative investments. It is a challenge sometimes to wade through the lack of transparency and find out the reality of what's actually happening. So Sam has asked, what is the source of the 21 times positive impact, please? Be great to understand the ranges and what things make the big differences. So I think perhaps let's hold that, and if we could come back to that one at the end, because I know we're going to reference that later, Sam. And Alison is asking, putting the impact of your pension in simple terms, such as driving a car for 50 years is very insightful. I particularly like the kettle to cheeseburger ratio myself. I found that very helpful. So I just want to ask a really quick question, and I'm going to do this in a poll actually, because I think many of you are got your cameras off. So I just want to gauge your reaction. I've just put a couple of questions up on the poll. You should see them pop up on your screen. So there's 2 questions, and these are really aimed at helping us understand where you are with no judgment in terms of how much you've done in terms of greening your financial decisions. The first question is asking you how much of a role impact plays in your day-to-day decisions. And the second one is asking, have you ever considered what your money in the bank, savings, investments and pensions is invested in, and what activities it might be supporting? So I can see there's a couple of people just voting. Let me just give them a second to do that. I'm just going to share that at this point. So that may not be everybody in the group, but just as an indication, we see that lots of us consider impact in our day-to-day decision making. So that's almost everybody here who's voted. But in terms of actually considering the mechanics of where our money actually is, there is perhaps a distinction between I've thought about it a bit to actually really thinking about it a lot. So I'm going to pause at this point, and we're going to hand back to David. And David is now going to take us through some of the kind of the details or the TLC of financial planning and helping you think about how you make your money work more effectively for you. So David, let me know what you would like from me, and I'm just going to spotlight you for everybody's benefit.
Perfect. Well, you could flick onto the next slide there, Lucy. And I think that's a really interesting poll result from what admittedly is going to be a very biased audience, right? But everybody wants to do something, but clearly there's some confusion around how that gets executed. So you could just imagine what that would be like amongst the wider community. I think you'd see an even bigger diversity between the two. Right, now, this is the meat and drink of the sort of practical takeaway from the session. So it's trying to give some relevance to a more personal context of what your money is doing for you. I hope we're making the case reasonably convincingly that all investments have an impact, and it's either going to be negative or neutral, or it could be positive. But left to its own devices, it's largely going to be negative, and it's not because we don't care, it's just because we don't understand to execute or how we execute. So hopefully we're establishing the point. To John Burgess's comment, you can do well by doing good, but the question is how do you find the green option? And yeah, the correlation of those charts just shows that there's not much to give up in terms of the behavior of these assets, but that the financial performance might be a little bit better. Right, I'm going to rattle through this. So this is meant to be taking one of the most complex, boring subjects, a 3-year degree course, and distilling it down into a kind of 8 to 10 minute presentation. So hold on to your hats. Here we go. So actually I just see I am not a co-host, Lucy, so I'm going to need that in order to do my little drawing on the screen. So if you could fix that and let me know when it's done.
That's done.
Okay, cool. Right, so your screens are about to go white, and if someone could give me a thumbs up that they've just got a white thing on the screen, that's cool. Right, so TLC, this is the three key components of financial planning, which I call timeline, ladders of tax, and circles of wealth. And I'm just going to run through why they're the critical components of financial planning, and give a very high level explanation of all. Now, T's timeline. So this is your life, okay? So here you are. I'm just going to make a generic stick person here, and it doesn't really matter what age you are. You are what you are, but at some point, at the other end of your timeline, I'm afraid to have to tell you, if you hadn't figured it out already, RIP, and that's the end of you. Now, financial planning is all about the question, have I got enough money for the rest of my life, or for the rest of the life of the people that I care about? What does financial security look like to me? And as a business owner, if you're one of those, then it's impacted on the financial performance of your business, notwithstanding just the way that you look at that. We've already established that thinking about these things is A, boring, and B, complex. But third of all, I might venture to suggest a little bit scary, because we have to deal with this bad boy down here, who might actually arrive rather earlier than we would want it to, or ill health or something like that. So how much is enough for the rest of your life? Well, it would be a pretty simple question to answer, wouldn't it? You only need to know 4 things. How long you're going to live, how much you're going to spend in every year of your life, what investment returns are going to be for the rest of your life, and what inflation is going to be for the rest of your life. So, hey presto, straightforward, eh? No, not as it turns out. I've written a dotted line on here, pounds X. Let's just assume this is the amount of money that you want to spend in a given year, or that you do spend in a given year. For most of us, we've got an income which covers that. It might be a salary, it might be a profit from a business, and what have you. And every year that goes by, as long as we're working and have the capacity to work and have the capacity to earn an income at the level that supports the lifestyle that we've got, we're fine. We also know that at some point on our timeline, and let's just assume it's here, which would be age 67 for most people, there's a state pension which comes in, which is about £9,000 a year. So at some point, some of our lifestyle cost will get met for the rest of our life. But there's likely to be a gap between what the state provides and the level of expenditure that we want to have. We don't know what's going to happen to expenditure. It could be that you have to go into long-term care at some point, in which case there's a very big gap indeed. It could be that you don't make it that far at all, so there isn't a shortfall. Lots of unknowns, right? It also may not be that you want to continue working up to the point that the state tells you you can stop. So we might put another point on the timeline here, which is financial independence, and this is the finishing post as far as you're concerned, the point that you'd like to finish. So let's just say when these incomes stop. And if you're fortunate as a business owner, the year in which your income stops could coincide with a business sale. And that could be quite a binary outcome in terms of whether you've got enough money for the rest of your life or not, but it's a dangerous thing to rely on. If you're in the fortunate position of having a surplus here or some surplus income, you can invest it in things like pensions and ISAs and unit trusts. And these are our circles of wealth, which we'll come onto shortly. But before we get there, we'll call this a general investment account or a GIA. We need to learn a little bit about tax. But whatever this hatched area is your shortfall, if you will, and most of us have got one of those, unless we've been in the fortunate position of having a business sale or two, or an inheritance, or family wealth, or what have you. You may already have too much and you haven't thought about it, in which case, why are you continuing to work? You know, maybe everybody loves what they do, or maybe they don't. But very quickly, because I'm conscious of time, you can earn £12,500 in the UK, which up to that amount is your personal allowance. You pay 0 tax on that. You then pay 20% tax on the next 37,500, which takes your income up to 50,000. Then you pay 40% tax on earnings above that. It gets more complex between 100 and 125,000. The tax rate actually goes up to 60%, then it goes back down to 40%, and then from 150,000 up, it's 45%. So much for a linear tax system. But here's the thing: if your income lands, say, here, which is a feasible level of income, you're losing at least 40 cents on the dollar. You can get that back by investing in pensions. If you put that 60p you're left with into a pension, you get the 40p back. As employers, we can also get the national insurance contributions back. But without thinking about it, you're giving money away to the government. Now, not to say tax is a bad thing, but the more you can save for your own benefit, you can choose to give money to causes that you care about. Now, there's a thing called the tax-free space, which is not really accessible to us whilst we're earning, but is accessible from savings. So let's say we take some of this surplus investable income and put it into pensions. We've already seen you can leverage your money. You can almost double your money by putting it into pensions because of the effect of tax relief. How do we fill this gap that we identified earlier? We take the money out of our savings structures. So a quarter of a pension fund can be taken tax-free. We can stick a tap on that in later life and draw a quarter of the fund in here. The other 3/4 of the pension fund, you've had tax relief on it at a very generous level. You're meant to pay tax on the other 3/4, but you could choose to take 12.5 grand a year out after you've finished work, but before you turn your estate pension on, and get most of the 3/4 out tax-free. Worst case scenario, you'll pay 20% tax on it. An ISA grows free of capital gains tax, but has also got tax-free income from it. So you can have another component of tax-free income from that. And a general investment account gives you 11 grand a year of capital gains tax-free income and £2,000 a year worth of dividend income, tax income. And this is just for one person in a couple. If there's 2 of you, then you can double up on this. So we can see 2 times 12.5, if you will, would be 25 grand a year. 2 times the capital gains is another 22,000 a year tax-free income, tax-free dividend income from a general investment account, and so on and so forth. In work, most of your income falls into the taxable space. In retirement, most of your income can fall into the tax-free space. Now, if you don't understand how tax works and you don't understand where the money can go into in terms of the circles of wealth, and you don't think about what do I want to be spending on my lifestyle and when and how much is enough, and let's have a stab at some of these questions around what finances are going to be like, then we're going to be clueless. We're just going to have our head in the sand. It's boring and it's complex and it's slightly frightening and I don't understand it. And this is where working with a financial planner can be extremely revealing, because we talk to you about this stuff and make it personal to you, make it personal to your family, make it personal to your business, and take the complex and try and make it into a more straightforward and simple process for you. And we've got some tools which take this back of an envelope calculation and actually make it rather more scientific. So there we go. Very quick run through financial planning in 10 minutes.
quite a task to do. I'm sure there's many people here like me that are not naturally gifted as accountants in their own lives. So thanks for the kind of quick rundown on the basics of financial planning. David's going to speak to us again in a couple of minutes in terms of how this particularly relates in terms of greening your money. So some of the kind of practical steps that you can do. I'm just interested in if anybody's got any questions at this point, because we've heard quite a lot of information. I wanted to just really briefly recap what you said when we asked you to register for the event. Some of the things that you said were on your money minds. So the things that you said to us, that you found it difficult to understand how to make decisions, and you wanted to understand what would be some good options for beginners. You said that you were interested in how do you avoid greenwash in terms of using the right benchmarks to help you understand that you are investing in true sustainability. You also wanted some suggestions on how you could ensure that your green investment got the best return in terms of capital, and also particularly whether now is a good time to be investing given the state of the market. So there's some of the questions that you had posed to us previously. Fiona, we've had a few in the chat box. I'm wondering if there's any that you found of interest that you wanted to share.
Well, I was interested perhaps in bringing in Sam Hill, if he's free, because you were quite detailed in what you wanted to get out of it, Sam, and also talking about divestment and activism. So I was really curious about your views on that. Are you there, Sam?
Yes, Sam.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I'm not knowledgeable. I'm not a financial practitioner of any sort. But yeah, I've heard various things about kind of opinions on thinking more of businesses or organizations, the choice between, trying to influence the companies you have shares in versus divesting. And I was kind of wondering the opinion of some of the panel, or anyone really, but kind of, I suppose, obviously this, how big are your investments and how big is your say and how to go about it, and yeah, just generally keen to hear opinions.
So let's just hold that question for the moment, but there's a real thing there on the ultimately, how do you have your money have most influence, not just in terms of your return, but how can your money be influencing companies' practices in their own right? So do keep continuing putting some questions in the chat box. I can see that Victoria from Path Financial is putting in lots of really helpful links. In today's session, we're obviously just giving you just the snapshot of some of the key principles to think about, but a lot of the links she's sharing are going to be really giving you much more detail on some of the questions we're discussing. Just noticing John's comment, I heard one comment recently, everyone should buy one share in the evil companies, and then everyone can turn up to the shareholder meetings to drive change. If you've ever done any shareholder activism, it's definitely quite fun. But that is definitely one very effective method you can use. So just holding that there, we're going to move back to David again, who's now going to start talking to us about some practical takeaways. And yes, share action are absolutely brilliant at shareholder activism if you are interested. So David, I'm going to pass back to you for another kind of 5 or 10 minutes or so, where you're going to talk to people about how they can take their kind of financial health check.
Sure.
That's okay. Yep.
Perfect. Let's just hold the slides for a moment, because I think to pick up on that point of Sam's, and it's one that's cropped up a couple of times in the chat, it's really useful to introduce this question of where do I start and what do I do in terms of this argument. Now, who can remember back to their GCSE maths and Venn diagrams? And we had a square box, didn't we, which was it E or U, the universal set of all possible investments we might be talking about in terms of this talk. Within that universal set, there would be a great big circle, which would be a thing called investment funds, or all investment funds. And that might be where you entrust your money to a manager who will give you a diversified portfolio aligned to your attitude to risk. Within that circle, there would be a smaller circle, which traditionally would have been called ethical investment, which comes from a faith-based background predominantly. So it looked at the exclusion of sin stocks, if we want to think of it in those terms. So it was the avoidance of alcohol and tobacco and weapons, principally, and other more exploitative investments. These days, the ethical universe tends to be branded ESG, environmental, social, or governance, or SRI, back to Rowan's talk. And these days, there's usually an exclusion around fossil fuels in there because of the environmental impact. So that's the ethical universe, and within that, we've got the sort of impact or positive impact universe, which is actually, again, still using funds. And yes, excluding the sin stocks and the environmental polluters, and by some definitions, animal agriculture, but particularly investing in the solutions rather than just avoiding the problem. So it's a proactive way of encouraging, let's say, wind farms over thermal coal. You can still.
So, David, can I ask what would be where would be some places for people to start with this decision making?
Well, it's really hard because you first of all got to get through the greenwash question. So you could, I suppose, buy butter, which was advertising itself as being 15% fat-free. And we find this type of approach, if I can call it that, in our universe. So to Sam's point, and to really pick up on that, I think you either spend a really huge amount of time looking at the ethical universe and then trying to find something called impact, and then looking at the top 10 holdings of every different fund, and then making your own judgment on whether what the companies say, the fund managers and the underlying companies, whether they're genuinely walking the walk and whether that's aligned to your moral and ethical position. But it's desperately time consuming. Now, I would say this, wouldn't I, because it's what we do, but I think there's a lot of time to be saved by delegating that thinking and process to experts. And actually that's what we do, because even as the leading firm in this space, we want to speak to analysts who really get under the bonnet of this thing. It will amuse Rowan because I keep trotting this analogy out, but you could do your own dentistry if you wanted to save a few quid and you were interested in the subject. Not something I'm going to do in a hurry. I want to delegate that particular job to someone who's an expert at what they do. I think it's rather like it in here. So, Sam, to that point, divestment versus engagement. I think you kind of want to be doing both in a sense. I mean, divestment is the sort of ultimate sanction, but if we can engage with companies, that's what will influence change. So how do you get engagement? Well, first of all, you recognize that your money has got an impact. Second of all, you challenge the investment manager that you're currently with. And if they don't care about this stuff, then you've got a negative impact. So you might want to think about moving your money, at which point you start to think about how do we, who's going to care about engagement with the board of BP? And go, oh, we call you Beyond Petroleum now, do we? Well, that's very interesting. Maybe we could just talk to you about some of what you're doing and accelerating the pace of change. You're not going to do that by ignoring what your money's doing. You're not going to do that by being in passive funds. You're not going to do that by getting confused around what's going to go on. The only way you're going to do that is to speak to fund managers who make a mandate in actually engaging and saying if the pace of change is not quick enough, then we diversify. It's only recently there's sufficient funds in the fund universe to be able to do this. And I think I would also say there are controversies. You know, is nuclear a hideous polluter or is it an interim technology that we need? Are electric vehicles a fantastic tipping point or do we need to reduce travel altogether? And by the way, it's got a hideous mining impact. Where do you sit on the vegan issue? How do we understand what banks are doing with our money? And you know, there are various tools that are out there. So to finish this particular rant off, I would just say the current mantra is don't let perfect get in the way of progress. So consciousness and taking some action, I think, are critical. And the more people that move these trillions, and there are trillions, and the more influence that we have, the more granular these themes can become, and the more you can tilt things to your own particular moral standpoint.
So David, can I just jump in just as we sort of move towards the last 10 minutes of the event? Are there particular points that you wish to refer to in your slides in terms of practical steps people can start?
Yeah, so let's just skip to them very quickly. So where do we start? I talked about an ostrich mentality earlier, or the question of things being boring or complex. First thing to do is to get your head out of the sand and actually confront this. Difficult things happen with purpose when you confront it, so that's meant to just be a little humorous character there. Through us, next slide would be just jump on our website, which is path.co.uk. There's find out more buttons are all over the website. Please do inquire. We promise to come back to you very quickly. From a business perspective, on the next slide, which we talked about in the chat, we've recently introduced the Green Pension Pledge. Now, this is having made you aware of the fact that your supply chain has impact, you could do something about it, which is actually think about, oh, hang on a minute, where is my pension in terms of my supply chain? You probably do a lot to have the greenest possible option from pencils through to paper, but what about pensions? That's certainly something you could think about and that your employees will thank you for thinking about. So from a business perspective, we can talk about the pensions pledge. From a personal perspective, we're just on the website. And I think the last slide that I was going to talk to, well, in fact, no, that was it, actually. Then we're going to give the last couple of minutes to Rowan, I think.
We will do in a moment. So thanks, David. So there's a couple of real practical things that he's just noted. Just reiterating, as Victoria has been putting a lot of really super useful links in the chat box. We will, the recording of this event is going to be shared afterwards. You can also download the chat if you want to make sure that you have got a copy of the links that have been shared as well. So please do that. There was just one question that popped up that I wondered whether you could speak to quickly, David. So Jose has asked, or has noted, companies are not financial advisors to their staff, and so there is a constraint and a fine balance there. Any advice on how we can go about that?
That's a great question, actually, Jose, and it puts me right on the spot. There are, about you could come to us, and part of our Green Pensions Pledge process is to analyse what companies have currently got and give an impartial whole of market assessment as to what greener options would be. And it might be something which is left to individual employees and their conscience to decide what they want to do with. But many workplace pensions, because they're built down to a price rather than up to a standard, typically have got very few ethical options, let alone positive impact or green options. But yes, if you feel the employees need financial advice, you're going to have to find a financial advisor and pay for it. I think, unfortunately, is the bottom line.
So some fairly clear feedback there. I mean, just it makes me hark back to your comment previously about how labour intensive it can be to understand the complexities in this area, and that people do this if they have the time and the energy to really look into and do the deep research required. Sometimes it can be easy, obviously, to just get a little bit more guidance. So hopefully some of the links that are in the chat will at least give you a starting point, depending on the different factors. So we're coming up towards the last few minutes of the event today. I just want to check, I'm going to check in briefly, Fiona, if there are any questions or comments that you noticed that you thought were of interest that would be helpful just to highlight very briefly.
I think the issue that I would highlight really is that many people in our membership anyway are small businesses who then would want to get their members, their employees encouraged on that path. So Jose's question was really important. And I guess one of the questions here, I saw that Andy Middleton at TYF has got his pension with you, but I presume Path Financial and others offer a service to the business, not just to the individual. Is that right, David?
Well, to one other, both either, it really doesn't. We deal with businesses and we deal with individuals, and we're happy to give at least one free session, irregardless of who you are. There's often an anxiety that, oh my goodness me, financial advisors are for really, really rich people, and no, they're not necessarily, and we're certainly happy to give our time. And if there is an inability to pay our fee, then we can point people in the direction of where there are some DIY services or some others. But for the business owner, then the business and the personal finances are inextricably linked, and there's a real double down actually on the consequences of that, because if the business fails, then maybe the financial plan fails with it. So there's a lot of extra, and you're 100% responsible for your own outcomes. So
that's great. Well, let's pass back to Lucy as we're nearly at 3 minutes to 2. Yeah.
David, some helpful offers there to get you started. There's 2 things I want to just ask you really quickly before I pass over to Rowan to finish up. The first thing is I've just popped a link in the chat box that's helpful for us just to get a little bit of feedback. It may well be the questions that you've still got hanging. It also gives you the option to say if you would like more information from Path or from Business Declares. So just invite you to do that. I would also love to hear if we've inspired any actions today. Now, that may well be that you need to go away and look for more information on something rather than having made a decision per se today. Be really helpful in the chat box if you've had any actions that have come to mind. It'd be really great to hear that. But what I'm going to do is pass very briefly to Rowan, just for some closing remarks from Path. And I think you're also going to refer back to the 21 multiple data, the figure and the origin of that, if that's possible. So I am going to hand over to you to do that.
Lovely, thank you very much, Lucy. So very, very briefly, because we are short on time, aren't we? So Make My Money Matter have a fantastic campaign. You can see their logo up in the corner actually. Go onto their website, use their resources. They are fantastic. There's a really helpful link to the report that they did in conjunction with Aviva, in fact, and as to where that figure has come from. But it's very much a case of, looking at the Office of National Statistics data, looking at average carbon footprints, traditional investing versus, the carbon savings from taking other action, such as having a plant-based diet or changing to using an electric vehicle. One takeaway from this is take some action, however small it might be. Take some action, do some research, get in touch, find out more, look under the bonnet at where your investments are. And I hope that has been a really good driver, just having this information and knowing that you have a choice. I'll pass back to Lucy.
That is a compelling call to action, Rowan. It's almost like you've finished webinars before, but it is a very clear call to action, really. If you really only do a few things, moving your money is one of, by miles, the most effective and the most cumulative things that you can do. Fiona, do you want to just say a couple of closing words from Business Declares very quickly?
Yeah, just to say thank you to David and Rowan and the whole team at Path Financial, and we really hope that you might, if you're on this webinar for the first time, follow up with Business Declares, and we'll be putting a video of recording of this on our website. And if you want to find out Vaishnavi, who's with us here, or myself, we'd be very happy to talk to you if you want to find out about membership as well.
Fantastic, thanks Fiona. And just a little nod that the Business Declares contact details are here, and we will put them up in the wrap up email. If you're not too familiar with Business Declares, we're a voluntary network supporting businesses to help take action on the climate emergency. It doesn't matter whether you're a small business or a huge business, but please do get in touch if you want to join what is a very supportive and very helpful peer network. So I'd like to say thanks very much. We're bang on 2 o'clock. As I said earlier, the recording from today will be circulated later. It will be available in the email and also on YouTube, I believe. If you've got any questions, please do get in touch with us. I think we've had some email addresses shared in the chat. And just to encourage you to pop some answers into that feedback form, if you could find a couple of minutes, that would be wonderful. I'm just going to put the link back there. So that's it. Thanks very much, everybody. I'd like to say thanks particularly to David, Victoria, Carla and Rowan, and also to Fiona and Vaish. And I wish you all a very happy afternoon. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Lucy.
Take care, everybody.
See you later.